Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Greenberg, and I'm a reporter for SC Magazine. Welcome to our e-symposium on data security. Our next session is titled Reality Check, Security versus Privacy and the Insider Threat, sponsored by SpectorSoft. Our presenter today is Mike Tierney, Vice President of Operations with SpectorSoft, who is responsible for the overall product strategy at SpectorSoft. Prior to joining SpectorSoft, Mike oversaw a large product portfolio that included solutions for desktop security, least privilege management, file access control and reporting, and compliance. People such as NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, an insider who blew the lid off the vast and indiscriminate surveillance system PRISM, are a reminder to companies that background checks and interviews are not always foolproof. Sometimes the greatest threat is on the inside, a person with proper access who uses it improperly. This session will involve the unique challenges associated with detecting and preventing insider threats. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Mike. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everybody that's carved out some time to be with us today. I appreciate it. We did want to spend some time talking about the insider threat and what that looks like, and I think by nature of the folks that we have in attendance that we all probably have a pretty common understanding, but I did want to talk a little bit about that, so we're working from the same baseline. And obviously there's been quite a bit of news. We want to talk about the impacts that those threats can have, and some of the challenges in dealing with them, as Adam alluded to. And in his introduction, he did a great job of kind of setting the table for what is an insider threat. What we're really talking about is people that have authorized or proper access and use that access in an unauthorized or improper way. If you think about that for a minute, people that have rights or permissions to a system or to data or to use an application don't set a lot of red flags when they use that system or access that data. You're logging it somewhere in an event log management solution, but it's normal. There's not a reason to look at it. Whereas unauthorized access attempts get flagged and security logs and alerts go off. So the insider challenge, or the challenge of the detecting the insider threat, is a little bit different. How do you detect unauthorized access, or authorized access, being used in an improper fashion? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then talk a little bit about what airport security can teach us about dealing with insider threats, because I think there are some lessons we can learn there, and then some approaches that you can take to dealing with them as well. So hopefully that'll be interesting for everybody. So let's dive right into it. And I wanted to start off first with a little bit of perspective. So a little bit about the status of the insider threat today. Verizon's 2013 data breach report is out. It has been for a while. A lot of you folks have probably seen it, but the thing that jumped out at me was the increase in the number of internal threats. Now, there's a lot of time and effort and expense that goes into defending against external threats, defending the perimeter, and that's completely appropriate and needs to continue. But I think the internal threats are getting to a point now that we can no longer ignore them. They're increasing. It seems like you can't pick up a paper or a magazine or read anything online without seeing another example of an insider threat. There was a story not that long ago about an employee from IBM who it looked like he was terminated, and he took a bunch of data about their cloud business and started leaking it out anonymously for revenge. So we continue to see these stories hitting out there. These are increasing, and part of the reason is, in my role as Vice President of Operations, one of the things I always look for is the employees of the company and continuous improvement. You want to always see your employees getting better, and you try to put an environment in place that lets that happen. When it comes to taking data off the network or committing things like employee fraud, that's not the area where you want to see that continuous improvement, but we are seeing it, and you can see some of the stats on the screen about how it's getting faster and easier to get data off the network. And if you think about how we've evolved from back when I was a kid and went to visit my father in his office in New York, and if you wanted to get data off the network, you had to print it because it was on a mainframe, and the printers were in some public area, and somebody would bring it up to you probably from the mailroom. So we've gone from all the way from that to drag and drop box, and the data's gone. So with that ease has come a lot more data getting off the network, a lot faster, and it's harder to detect. And you can see how long it's taken to discover data breaches and how that's becoming longer at an increasing period. So looking a little bit more inside this, there's some studies out there on what people's viewpoints are on company data, and is it okay? What's it okay to do with them? So if you look up at the screen here, the one that jumps out at me is that second bullet. 51% of employees in a semantic survey said that it was okay to take company data with them when they leave the company. That's a shocking number. I've seen other numbers, 47%, but feel pretty comfortable with 1 out of every 2 as a statistic. Think it's okay to take it with them. And then you can see some other statistics up there as well about, is it okay to reuse that data at your next company? So attitudes, I think, somewhat fueled by how easy it is to take it. People also might have it in their mind that, well, I worked on it, I created it, it's as much mine. But you can really see how easy people are taking data off the network, or how comfortable they are with it. And it's a scary thing. The first stat up there, transferring docs to a personal device, personal clouds, the Dropbox that I mentioned earlier, have just made this so easy to do, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. Talk a little bit about how people are getting it off and what people's attitudes are on taking company data. Let's look a little bit at the impacts of a data leak. So this was a great study that the folks at the Ponemon Institute did, and they went out and surveyed on what do people do when they find out their information was breached. So customers. And if you look at that first bullet, you almost don't need to look anywhere else. 19% end the relationship with the company. I'm not aware of a lot of companies that can afford to lose, 1 out of every 5 customers. Overall, I think, the quick math on that, that's 86% have a negative, and very understandably negative, reaction to learning about that. It's very, very damaging to a company's reputation and profitability, which then impacts all the other employees within that company who had nothing to do with this, right? But when companies start losing 1 out of every 5 customers, changes usually get made on staffing levels as well. So that's a little bit about the kind of data leaks and data breaches. I wanted to talk about another form of insider threat a little bit that maybe doesn't get quite as much publicity these days. But if you look at employee fraud, and this was very interesting to me. First of all, we talked about earlier, and Adam had mentioned the concept of authorized access being used improperly. So in more than 50% of fraud cases, it's exactly what the insiders are doing. And these statistics are pulled from a study from Carnegie Mellon University, from the CERT Insider Threat Institute, and very easy to find on the internet. The other stat that jumped out at me here was the gap between the time of somebody being hired and the start of fraudulent activity. And there's a 5-year gap on average between somebody's start date and when they engage in this fraudulent activity. And if you stop and think about that for a minute, we're talking about trusted employees. This is not a person that just came in and is doing something wrong. They've built relationships. It's your coworkers. It's the guys you go to lunch with sometimes. And the motivations are all different. We've been in a pretty prolonged period of economic uncertainty. Financial gain is the #1 motive. Why employees commit fraudulent acts. Revenge is also a really big one. I had a conversation with somebody the other day that said one of the prime motivators of employee fraud is actually if your boss is a jerk. The statistics bear it out. So it's very interesting. And the other thing that I noted that I found interesting here was that 80% of fraudulent activity gets committed during working hours. And it kind of goes back to how would you set a red flag? Well, a lot of times people look for odd working hours, people doing things at a time that doesn't necessarily make sense. In the case of fraud, at least, that's not a criteria that we can use based on the statistics and the studies that are out there. So with all that said, the question becomes, how do you deal with these insider threats? How can you detect them more reliably, earlier, so that you can deal with them before the damage gets out of hand? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And it kind of gets into what should you be watching. You need to be watching who has access to the sensitive information in your company, right? And you guys know better than I that you go out and you try to set the appropriate amount of privilege, the appropriate amount of rights, so that people can get their job done and not give them anything else. But people move around in roles within the company. Not everybody gets pigeonholed in just quite appropriately when they get onboarded. So you have to really carefully watch who can access the data, and you should be watching the data itself and the network and the applications used. And these are things that I think you guys know more about than I do, and that people are doing out there. I would say that you also, in conjunction with that, need to be watching the users themselves. You have to monitor employee activity, and there's a couple of different approaches to that, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. But to really be sure that your accesses and authorizations and permissions are being used for the reasons you granted them, you have to be able to take a look at the activity of the users. And I'm not alone in saying this. I've seen quotes from guys like Andrew Walls at Gartner that talk about employees with legitimate access to enterprise information assets are involved in the most security violations. So security monitoring must focus on employee actions and behavior. It's a partial quote from Andrew. I've also seen a quote, I read this on dark reading somewhere, said the human element is truly the most difficult to secure. I think it was John Sawyer that had written it, and that kind of really resonated with me, and it's true. I mean, people are generally the cause of all our problems, right? And if we just didn't have them, things would probably be a lot more secure, but a lot less productive. So you need to be watching all the traditional things, but you need to take a look at the users themselves. And a lot of times I like to take things out of technology. It's easier sometimes for me to understand. And if you have something of great value, a precious jewel or a painting in a museum, you're certainly going to alarm it and focus on it and watch it to make sure that it stays where you want it to stay. But if we stay on kind of that, let's say it's the famous painting, there's thousands of people coming by this thing every day. If you know that statistically speaking, there could be a couple of art thieves in there, shouldn't you start watching the crowd too? Is kind of the thought process that I approach this with. And so I think you need to take a look at the user. We talk a little bit about why. We talked a little bit earlier about a reality check. Well, interviews and background checks are necessary and important, but not foolproof, right? You can't necessarily weed out intent in an interview. And we talked earlier about that 5-year gap between somebody getting hired and fraudulent activity taking place. So something has changed in that person's situation over the course of time that you're not going to be able to capture during an interview or in a background check. There are stats out there as well about overwhelming majority of people that engage in employee fraud have no criminal history. It's not something that you would have flagged on earlier. We talked about securing the perimeter and how important it is, but with this growth in insider threats, how it just doesn't seem to be enough anymore. And I think it's important to step back and say that the companies have a right and a responsibility to know what's going on within the organization, to make sure they're doing everything they can to safeguard sensitive information, customer data. We have responsibilities to, certainly to our employers, to our shareholders, to our fellow coworkers who would suffer the impacts, as we talked about earlier, with if you started to lose customers in the state of something like a data breach, what that could do to people's lives. So I think that it's very important that we do everything that we can to secure against these types of threats, and there are ways that we can go about it to make sure that we're doing it the right way. And a lot of times, I'll have people say to me, well, you got to trust your employees. And I do, and I think you do to an extent, but I don't think anybody uses trust as the only strategy they employ. If that was the case, everyone would have the same permissions on the network, because we could just tell folks, please don't look at the things you're not supposed to look at, and trust that they won't. People wouldn't be using content filtering technologies to make sure that inappropriate content wasn't viewed on the web, because you could just trust people not to do it. Unfortunately, the realities of the world we're in, it just doesn't work that way. So I mentioned during the agenda I wanted to talk a little bit about airport security and what we can learn that might help us deal with insider threats a little bit more effectively. And as a starting point there, I wanted to contrast two approaches to airport security. The U.S. model, which is the one that I operate in, I'm based in Florida, where everyone is basically treated equally likely to be a threat. So we all go through the same security checkpoints, through the same security processes. We're all taking off our shoes and making sure that our toiletries are in a clear plastic bag so everyone can see them, and then we dance through the Exposomatic 3000 machine. And I always take comfort when I'm doing that, just as an aside, that it's far worse for whoever's viewing it than it is for me. But we all go through those same processes. And it's very different than the Israeli model, where they combine profiling with behavioral analysis, body language, and other indicators that I don't know what they are. And if I did, somebody would probably have to kill me. And if I told you, they might have to kill you too. So best to say they have a secret sauce that they use, but it is not one that treats everyone as equally likely to be a threat. And both models have proved effective. So the question is there anything we can learn from these models and apply internally as we go about our internal security? Well, let's talk about profiling a little bit. First, I want to make sure that I'm 100% clear that profiling on things like race and creed and gender, the types of things that get talked about in the news, is by definition bad, and I'm not recommending to anyone that you should do that. I think there are situations, though, that we can look at and glean from them that there may be a reason to take a closer look at someone. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'd like to kind of take it out of technology again if I can. So consider the situation where you're hosting a party at your house. You've got a nice house. You have some nice stuff in it. It's stuff that you'd like to hang on to. Maybe you have a baseball card collection, or just silverware you inherited from grandma that's really nice. It's in a drawer in the dining room. But this is stuff you'd like to hang on to. And you've got a bunch of people coming over. Say you've got 100 guests at your house. You find out, sometime early in that party, that of those 100 guests, 50 think it's okay to take something with them, a souvenir, if you will, when they leave. And that's what you find out, that they typically take that souvenir as they're on the way out the door. So maybe they're taking some of Grandma's silverware or the best baseball card in the collection. Well, if you knew that, wouldn't you keep an eye on the people that had their keys in their hands? I believe you would, because it's common sense. And I think that's a form of profiling, and that's what we're talking about today, is being able to look at situations and conditions and know that we have to keep a closer eye on activity. And the cause to do that can be any number of different things. The 50 out of 100 up there, I think you guys have already caught me with my little trick. That happens to be statistically the same number of employees we talked about in the earlier slide that thought it was okay to take corporate data. So this is my funny way of walking through that. But let's talk about some of the causes to take a closer look at people and maybe apply a little bit more scrutiny to them. So one would be companies or employees on the way out of the company. And I kind of use the phrase the high-risk exit period. The stats are overwhelming, 1 out of every 2. I mentioned the Carnegie Mellon, the insider threat guys up there at CERT. They have models that show that the vast majority of IT theft occurs within 30 days of somebody giving notice. So, again, if people have their keys in their hands and they're on the way out the door, that's when these kinds of bad things are most likely to happen. Doesn't it make sense to just take a closer look? Somebody gives notice. If it's their choice, or sometimes it's the company's choice to separate from an employee, why not take a closer look at those people and make sure that your IP, your important information, is safeguarded? So that's one condition that makes a lot of sense. Condition could be a tip or a suspicion, something external outside of technology. And that's a very common use case for our software, as a matter of fact. When people find out that something may be going bad, they conduct an investigation. A lot of you guys are probably involved in conducting them and have to dig into the employee's activity to figure out what have they done. And a lot of that involves pulling together clues from disparate systems. We're scraping logs. We're pulling out email files and trying to piece part things together. And that's a very common time that people will take a closer look at someone. It can also be role-based. Again, in his introduction, Adam talked about the Snowden example, or the Snowden case, and that drives into a whole discussion on kind of privileged users or highly privileged users. In this case, we're talking about system administrators that are have almost limitless access to networks, so kind of exist outside of that system of checks and balances that companies put in place. That gives them a disproportionate ability to do damage. And because of that, I think it's fair to say, should they be subject to a higher degree of scrutiny? And I think most system admins would understand that because they have the keys to the kingdom, there's going to be a little additional scrutiny. Now, we talked about airport security earlier. We don't have a checkpoint moment in IT. We don't have people coming in and say, okay, it's okay to check me now. So you need to be able to look at the activity that's going on by some of these highly privileged users and review it even if necessary, probably in a random way. And if you have 10 system administrators, you're probably hitting each one of them once every 2 weeks on some kind of random schedule. But if that's known, that's a pretty powerful deterrent to going rogue, which is what I think we saw with Snowden. So there are different conditions that can cause us to want to take a closer look at employees' activity. So I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about, if you make that decision, if you're ready to go down the road and do some employee user monitoring or employee activity monitoring, what's the right way to go about it? So the first step in doing that, we tell all of our customers, is to make sure your company has an acceptable use policy in place, that it's up to date, and that in that acceptable use policy, you disclose to your employees that you have and may exercise the right to monitor activity on company-owned devices and on the company network. I would also recommend that employees acknowledge that. I've seen companies do it with a signature when you're onboarded. I've worked in companies where you click through something at every logon, which I think has some diminished returns because you just get in the habit of clicking it and you forget what it is. I know that's what I deal with every time iTunes has an update. But different ways of having your employees acknowledge it. If you don't have one, or if you're not sure if yours is up to date, the link on the screen here is to a paper that we have that includes draft, sample, acceptable use policy language. I would recommend that you, as a starting point, it's great. You should have somebody legally review it and make sure it's right for your organization, make any tweaks to it that are necessary. But we wanted to make that available to everybody in case that there was something that, a situation where it could be of value to you. Now, once you have that done, now you have to look at options. You need to look for a way of doing this that gives you the options to strike the right balance for you. And I want to talk a little bit about, and you can probably tell from the title, and this was on the screen earlier, I'm a big Star Wars nerd, so I apologize for the references, but I couldn't help myself. So how do you go about putting the right balance in place between internal security and employee privacy? So there are some things you can do. Starts with disclosure in the acceptable use policy. Then you want to go about and look at what aligns to your corporate goals and how to implement that. So you want to monitor appropriately. You want to put the ability to review detailed user activity in the hands of the right people. I can't tell you who the right people are in your organization because I don't know everybody's company structure and how they're laid out. But these could be, depending on your company culture and local laws, it could be some HR folks, legal, could be folks from the CFO office, and if you're talking about things like employee fraud, that would be very logical. You'd have somebody that's tasked with the financial security of the company helping to review that. So you need to identify who inside should be the people that review this data. I don't think a lot of IT guys sign up to be the judge and the jury. I think as IT folks, it's our job to know what solutions are out there and to be able to implement them and enable the internal security for the company, but it doesn't mean that we have to be the ones weeding through the data and saying, I found out what we need to find. Don't monitor everybody the same way all the time. We kind of covered this already. Depending on the conditions, there are different levels of monitoring that you might want to apply, and I'm going to talk about some options on that in just a minute. And then you want to take steps to stay out of people's personal business, and we'll run through that a little bit as well. I think the key theme for this is that every company is different, and everybody's going to have a different balance point between security and internal privacy. and everybody's going to feel comfortable tilting that balance from privacy to security at different times. There's different degrees of seriousness that people will apply to an alert or an incident, so you want to make sure that you can do this in a way that's right for your company. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about what's right for you. So there are two approaches that you can take to user activity monitoring. The first is active monitoring. Excuse me, I just had to grab a little drink there. An active monitoring approach is one where you're recording user activity, you're pulling it into a database, and people are in there and they're looking at it, and you're generating alerts off of it, but it's being reviewed. We talked about privileged user monitoring and the Edward Snowden example. That'd be a great use case for an active monitoring solution, right? Where you need to be watching what's going on here. We have to take our responsibilities to secure this data internally and do everything we can to make sure that we're safe. So an active monitoring approach is great for those situations. But what about for kind of the rest of the world, the people that don't have the godlike power, the people that we don't have a trigger or a reason to investigate already? Well, in that case, you might look at a passive monitoring solution. And passive monitoring approach is one where you're basically logging all of the employees' activity. It's there if you need it, kind of like a black box or a flight recorder on a plane, but you wouldn't look at it unless there's a problem. And in the case of a passive monitoring approach, you might not even be able to look at it unless decisions were made by the folks, the right people in your company, to say, go ahead, let's open up that file and look. But it's good to know that it's there. We talked earlier about the amount of IP theft that goes on with people leaving a company. If you had that 30 days of history that aligns to what those insider threat models show, you'd be in a pretty good place to keep your company's IP safe. So two different approaches to monitoring. And you want to go out and look for a solution that can support those. I'm going to talk a little bit about SpectorSoft and what we do, and a little bit about how we support those options. We monitor user activity. We record the digital activity of employees, right? And you can see up the screen the different types of things that we capture. In an active monitoring approach, we pull that into a database. In a passive monitoring, we keep it securely logged somewhere else unless it's necessary. So that's what SpectorSoft does and what we record. So I'd like to talk just really quickly on the difference between the active monitoring and the passive monitoring approach. So in that active monitoring, which is the Spector 360 product that we offer, we go ahead and record all of the activity that we just talked about on the previous screen, and we write that activity to a very secure SQL database kept on premises at our customers' locations. We can then generate alerts off of that data, and they can be relayed out to the Spector 360 administrators or to whoever the company deems appropriate. And that data is available to be reviewed, reported on, and retained because it's in that central database. So that's the active monitoring approach. In our passive monitoring approach, Spector 360 Recon, we record all of that same information, but we store it securely on the local machine where it takes place. And then we pass only alert data through the central store. So none of that detailed activity data is taken off, only the alert data. Those alerts can be generated and sent out to whomever the company has determined should receive them. We talked about fraud. In case of a fraud indicator, it might be to someone in the CFO's office. It could even be something as simple as inappropriate language or sexual harassment type language in the workplace. Those alerts might be going to HR. Once those alerts are received, the recipient then has an option. They can decide, is what I've seen serious enough to cause me to want to unlock that detailed active monitoring? And if they want to, they can go ahead and ask for Recon, the passive monitoring approach, to be changed to the detailed or active monitoring approach. All of that 30 days of data is then pulled into the central store and is available, again, for review and reporting and retention. So you can see everything that happened before, during, and after an alert. So that's the difference between the two approaches. It's the way we support both of them. Real quickly on Spector 360 Recon, because it is a new offering from us, so if you're not familiar, with SpectorSoft. You can get caught up with the rest, and if you are, talked a little bit about it. It creates that employee activity log and stores it on the machine where it's recorded. Again, like a flight recorder or a black box, and no one ever wants to look at it because it means there was a problem. But everybody's glad that it's there, so we can learn and respond and react appropriately. We can then generate alerts off of that data and send them out, as we just talked about. But this approach was designed in response to customer request and customer demand. We had a lot of customers that were frustrated that they were not using employee activity monitoring solutions more widely in their company, but it got back to that balance between security and privacy, and the companies weren't comfortable tilting that balance from security to privacy without a cause or a reason to do so. So this Recon approach is designed to maintain that balance. The data's locked away for no one to see unless a cause occurs, and then when it does, it can be unlocked. A nice side benefit from that, we went about it that way for privacy, but because the data is stored on the client, very little information coming across the network, just that little bit of alert data. Don't need a lot of dedicated storage, so it really has a lower impact on IT, which is a nice kind of side benefit that came off of that. So two approaches that we can support, active monitoring and passive monitoring, with the passive monitoring really designed with employee privacy in mind. Further into that, and we can apply what I'll talk about here to either one of those approaches, we have additional privacy protections that can be employed. So we talked a little bit about making sure that the right people are involved in the decision to go ahead and look at detailed information. You want to do that, and there are some simple things that you can do to make sure that that's thing. The simplest one is you can split the password that gives access to the database, right, the SA password, and we have a number of customers that do just that. The 360 administrator has 4 characters, somebody in HR has the other 4, and now you have a 2-key missile approach that's very effective in making sure that the right policies inside the company are used before this information is reviewed. So that's a very simple privacy approach that can be taken, or privacy-enhanced approach to monitoring that can be taken. You also want to think about what you want and what you need to monitor. So I mentioned earlier aligning to company goals. If you're worried about people accessing sensitive data, then go ahead and monitor program activity and put document tracking on so you know if they're loading stuff off to personal clouds or to USB sticks. But you're not worried about what websites they visit, don't monitor it. Align your monitoring policies to your goals. And that's another way that you can minimize the impacts of that on privacy. Beyond that, there are certain things that you just don't need to get involved in. If you want to stay out of your employees' personal business, well, here's an example. You don't want to record where they do their online banking, so go ahead and block the banking sites. And with direct deposit these days, you can probably pretty easily figure out every bank that your employees are using and make sure that they're blocked. Or you can go ahead and ask your employees, where do you bank, and block them. So it's a way of staying out of your employees' personal business. You can go one step further and just not record passwords on websites. I don't know if you need to know your employee's Facebook password. Don't record it. So we've built these options into the product to allow customers to maintain as much privacy as they want to, but we wanted to do is put options in people's hands so they can strike the right balance for them. So just kind of last slide here, and then we'll hit the end of what I was hoping to cover today. Last point on balance, by the way, is you can go ahead and establish who can see that data beyond the split SA password. So you can have an administrator that can see everything, or you can restrict administrators to be able to only see little pieces of the information recorded. And I apologize, I meant to cover that off as well. So just real quickly, so you know what we're talking about, the active monitoring approach, we call that Spector 360, and the website's up there. The passive monitoring approach, we call that Spector 360 Recon. That is actually releasing to market right kind of as we speak. So we're excited about that. I encourage you to go out and check it out. And that's what I had hoped to cover off today. So Adam, I'd kind of hand it back to you.
Thank you so much for that great insight, Mike. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. One here says, you talked about using monitoring to help deal with data leaks. What about DLP, and how is that different?
It's a great question. So DLP solutions are great, and they obviously have a huge role to play with dealing with data leaks. What they are is traditionally is content aware. So they look at the data. So back to that analogy that I used about the piece of art in the art museum, they're really good at focusing on the painting and kind of being the alarm system on the painting. And it's a necessary thing. What DLP solutions traditionally aren't is context aware. So you get into a lot of discussion on false positives with DLP. Our approach, our solutions are context aware, and by that I mean you can see what the user was doing and why. And combined with the DLP solution particularly, it's very powerful. So, think about someone taking a document and moving that off to, emailing it out to a webmail account. Well, that may or may not be bad. Now, if you look at that document and find out, well, that's your customer list, and it just got emailed off to a Gmail account, that looks bad. So now it looks like you may have a security problem. If you could go back a little bit in time and find out that the employee doing that was asked to by their boss, who's in another city for a meeting, and he's having a problem with his email account, so he needed to get the file. He asked it to be sent to his Gmail account. Contextually, you can understand that this was not actually a problem, so it helps eliminate some of the false positives. So hopefully that answered that question.
Okay. Next question. If you wanted to use a mix of active and passive monitoring, how would that work?
Good question. So I can speak to it from our solutions perspective. We actually give customers the ability, with the release of the Recon product, to manage both from within the same console. So if you had a group of employees that you were going to apply an active monitoring approach to, you can deploy detail policies to them and monitor them in an active way, and then monitor the rest in a passive way by applying Recon to those. But you can do that both from the same console, and then you can have some checks and balances built in on who's able to go ahead and change which approach is being used on an employee. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but from our perspective, it's done all from one console.
Okay. We talked about Snowden. Could this solution have been used to stop him?
Yeah, I thought we might get that one, and it's a great question. So, and I've been asked it actually quite a lot, and until very recently, I always started by saying I really don't know, because I didn't know enough about, and I don't think any of us did, how he went about doing what he was doing. The part I felt good about that we could definitively answer is what he took. So I've seen enough Congress people and senators and other folks on the Sunday morning news shows that keep saying, we just don't know what he took, we don't know how bad it is, we don't know the depth of what he took. Well, I know that if our solution was in place, we could have definitively answered that question. But recently I read an article just within the last day or so that kind of outlined a little bit, so it appears that part of his job, well, let me step back for a second, the NSA had an intranet site where they kept a lot of documents so that they could be collaborated on, so for productivity purposes. And you had to have certain levels of clearance to be able to access those. Well, Snowden had those accesses. It appears that his job, part of his role, was to actually move the documents off of that intranet to a more secure location. And the article that I read used the term perfect cover, and it was, he was moving documents. So how are you going to flag on the guy who's supposed to be doing it? And it's a really good question. So if you had an approach in place like ours where you were actively monitoring system admin activity and then randomly reviewing it, and if you were to go ahead and tell your system administrators, this is how we operate, it would have made it a lot harder. It would have been a very powerful deterrent for him. So I'm not going to go out and say, silver bullet, yeah, we would have stopped him, but I think based on what we know about, we could have added a lot of value to the NSA security there.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for this session today. Just a reminder to everyone, this session will be available tomorrow on scmagazine.com in our events section. At this point, we invite you to join us in our virtual expo hall where you can visit the SpectorSoft booth. Many thanks to Mike Tierney for being with us today and sharing all this great information. And, of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in.